Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about 6 common studying mistakes top students do not make. Let's get to it. Number 6, and we're counting them down by the way. Number 6, sleep. Well, it turns out there's actually really good evidence behind this and why it's important. So to start with, sleep helps us consolidate information. So you might have had the experience where you're playing a video game and you're struggling to get past a certain boss or a certain level, or you're working on a math problem and it is just not coming together. You finish your studying for the night, you finish your game for the night, and you go to sleep. You wake up the next morning and suddenly you're able to do it. That's what that consolidating of information is. Now, MIT did a really interesting study where they compared grades and the sleep and tracked the sleep of people, and what they found was there was a clear positive relationship between sleep and grades. Okay, fine, but here's the details of it. They found a relationship between time to bed and consistency of sleep. So they also interestingly found that sleep the night before didn't save the day. Now that does not mean stay up all night before your test. I'm pretty sure that's not going to have a positive relationship, but it's consistent sleep and time to bed had a positive effect. Next, number 5, studying too long. Top students don't do that, which sounds kind of weird, right? Because aren't we supposed to study quite a bit? Well, it turns out a scientist named Ebbinghaus discovered this idea of recency and primacy, 2 ideas actually. And the idea was the things we remember first and last tend to stick in our memory. This is probably familiar to you. Maybe you either had this experience or seen this done where someone lists out, a long list of numbers and asks people, what do you remember? Well, they remember the first and the last. So the more firsts and last you can have, the better, within reason. So one way to do this is something called the Pomodoro technique. And the Pomodoro technique essentially says, I'm going to study for a certain amount of time, then I'm going to take a break, then I'm going to study, then I'm going to take a break. And it's in kind of fixed intervals. So one approach is study for a 25-minute chunk, then take a break. But during that study time, make sure you're focusing. Make sure you have a little paper beside you when, if you get distracted, you can write down what that thought is so it doesn't keep coming back as a reminder in your brain. The other thing is, pick what you're going to study. Select the information you're going to cover in that session, because it's a lot easier to stay focused when your brain recognizes, okay, once I get through this, then I'll get a little bit of a break. Number 4, studying in groups. So you have probably seen people, or maybe you've been one of these people yourself, who is in the library on the main floor with those big tables where everyone else is studying, and they're all a bunch of buddies, all a bunch of friends who are studying together. They study for a long amount of time. Maybe they have a phone nearby. Maybe they have a conversation. Well, it's been a little while. Maybe it's time to go get some food. Next thing you know, they've been there for a long time, but not a lot of studying has gotten done. So they get to the exams, they're like, well, what happened? I studied all this time. Well, it turns out they didn't really study all this time. So don't study in groups. Find a good nook, a quiet place in the stacks or in one of your school buildings where you can go by yourself or with a couple of other people and really stay focused. Number 3, multitasking. I'm sorry to tell you, it's just not a thing. Our brains, there's tons of evidence for this now, our brains don't work that way. They don't work in parallel where they can be doing multiple things simultaneously. What's really happening is there's rapid fire task switching, where one thing takes a second or two of processing, then the other, then the other, then the other. So you end up with a lot of time on shallow work instead of a smaller amount of time on deeper focused work. Top students know to spend that little time or lesser time on deep focused work. Number 2 is using practice exams effectively. So an Australian education company surveyed like a huge number of students. One of the clearest things they found was that there was a relationship, very good relationship, between the amount of practice questions people did and their overall grade. So step number 1 is do practice questions, do practice exams. There's a subtlety to it as well. You may see people who will misuse these exams, and what they'll do is they'll do the practice tests with an open book, at their desk, with a coffee, take a break, go get some food, and they're in no way simulating the reality of what they're going to experience. And unless it's an open book test, what they're really doing is just doing a practice question with assistance from the book. And that's one of the wastes, I guess I would say, and then maybe the misuses of these practice exams. And so the second thing that they failed to do is use these as a diagnostic tool. So 1, simulate live conditions or exam conditions as best as you can. That gives you the feeling of tiredness and fatigue as you get later on, and it lets you almost do like a practice workout, if you will, a practice of it. The second thing to do is once you do that, use the information you get to diagnose what you need to do better. So I got all of these types of questions right, but I kind of got these ones wrong. This topic I don't know as well. So instead of saying, that's about what I would have gotten on the test or the exam, what you do is you say, okay, that's good. Now I know where I need to spend more time and focus a little more. So that's one of the great ways you can use practice tests. Number one, and before I go there, I probably should introduce myself. So I'm Ashley, the MBA coach. And here on this channel, we're dedicated to making videos to help you get higher grades, help you get the job you want, and basically get the most you can out of the time and the money that you're spending on your MBA. Okay, let's go to number one. Number one is top students will use the right study techniques. There is so much evidence that what the majority of students do, passive reading, highlighting, rereading, reviewing their notes, is actually highly ineffective. It is one of the least effective study techniques, but it's one of the most commonly used. And well, why is it? Well, part of it is, I think, to be fair, many people don't know better. They don't know better study techniques. Other reasons, there's low friction. It's actually pretty easy to get started. It's not that tough to go and grab a book, open it, and start reading it. The other reason is that you end up with what's called the illusion of competence. So when you've read something for your third time, you kind of start to recognize it. So you get there and you're like, yeah, I remember reading this. Yeah, no, I know that as well, okay. But you get to the test and you have to retrieve that information and use it, and suddenly a broad familiarity with it isn't actually enough. So what are the alternatives? I'm gonna highlight two of them for you. One is active retrieval or active recall. The idea being that you make questions for yourself and then you test yourself with them. So one way you could do it as you're going through a chapter or going through your notes is with each piece of information that's relevant, turn it into a question and make a big list of those questions and separate the answers to those questions. Then what you do is once you've made that big list, you hide the answers, whether it's through a flashcard system or just whatever, however you want to do it, and try and remember the answer to that question. You basically ask yourself it. And if you get it right, you put a little check mark beside it. If you got it wrong, you put an X beside it. And then you end up with this list of check marks and X's. What you do then the next day is go review those X's. Go check, try and answer those questions that you got wrong the day before. And there's obviously gonna be a smaller number, hopefully gonna be a smaller number of them than there were on your first day. And you're gonna have more check marks and more X's, maybe a few more, maybe some X's as well. The next day of that smaller list of questions you got wrong, go out, test yourself on those again. Eventually you're gonna end up with two things. One, you'll have answered all the questions correctly eventually. And two, you'll have got a hierarchy of what do you know well and what do you know less well. So if you need to do a quick review before the exam, what can you do? You can spend your time focused on those that you didn't know as well. You can review a smaller body of information and spend less time, your most valuable resource, spend less of that time on the stuff you know really well. Another technique that's really effective is called the Feynman technique. So Richard Feynman was a famous physicist. He was known as the great explainer. He's a great physicist, but also a great teacher. The Feynman technique is using an explanation and you explaining something as a way to reinforce the learning of it. So here's how it goes. I go learn some information using active recall or whatever evidence-based approach that I've settled on for that particular piece of information. Then I go try and explain it to someone. I explain it to them using really simple words and don't use jargon and fancy words as a way to kind of cover up the fact that I don't really know what I'm talking about. So what happens is I'm explaining it, I'm stumbling over certain parts, I'm not able to articulate it really effectively. So what do? It's probably, I go back and review it because what it probably means is I don't really understand that part. So I've explained, I've diagnosed, I've reviewed, then you go try and explain it again, and lo and behold, you're gonna have likely made quite a bit of progress, or realize there's another part that you don't quite know as well. And you do this a couple of times and suddenly guess what? You've learned the information and you've learned in a very effective way. You may have heard if you can't explain it, you don't really understand it. That's kind of what drives this process. So what have we talked about today? We've talked about 6 common mistakes that top students do not make. So number 6 is that they get enough sleep. Number 5, they don't study for too long at a stretch and they take advantage of firsts and lasts. Number 4, they don't study in groups. Number 3, they don't multitask. Number 2, they effectively use practice exams. And number 1, they use evidence-based, effective study techniques. If you like this video, I think you're gonna really like this one, and it's the things you should be doing before you arrive on campus for your MBA. Thanks so much for watching. Look forward to seeing you again next time.